Luke Mason has always believed that his farm was more than just acres of tilled soil. It was a legacy. A third-generation farmer with hands hardened by years of labor and a heart full of passion for his rural way of life, Luke's Mason homestead was his sanctuary. Nestled on the outskirts of a suburban sprawl that prized conformity over character, his property boasted rolling pastures, time-worn orchards, and a venerable red barn that had witnessed generations of family celebrations and quiet moments of reflection. The barn was the soul of Mason Homestead. It served not only as a storage for tools and memories, but also as a gathering place for neighbors and friends during community events. Over the years, Luke had restored the barn with the same care he devoted to his crops, a symbol of tradition and resilience. However, that sense of pride was about to be tested by a force that sought to impose its own version of order on his cherished property. At the helm of the local homeowners association, HOA, was Kerren, a self-appointed guardian of suburban aesthetics, who believed that every home and property should conform to an idealized vision of perfection. With her crisp outfits, perfectly styled hair, and a clipboard always at the ready, Kerren prided herself on enforcing a strict set of rules. To her, deviations were not expressions of individuality, but affronts to the collective image of the community. One bright Saturday morning, as Luke was inspecting his barn, he was startled to see a flurry of activity that he'd never expected on his own property. Guests in formal attire and elaborate decorations had transformed his barn into a makeshift wedding venue. Strings of fairy lights and fresh floral arrangements adorned the ancient wooden beams. Word had spread, without his permission, that Kerren had organized an extravagant wedding celebration in his barn. Outraged, Luke strode up to the barn's threshold just as Kerren emerged from a crowd, clipboard in hand and an air of self-satisfied authority about her. "Luke," she announced coolly, "your barn has been deemed non-compliant with our community's usage standards. Today's event is our way of remedying your property's deficiencies." Luke's eyes narrowed. "Kerren, my barn has always been my private space, a symbol of my family's legacy. I never gave you permission to hold a wedding here." His voice trembled with anger and disbelief, and a few nearby guests exchanged awkward glances. Kerren's response was icy. "The rules apply to everyone, Luke. If you won't conform, then you must face the consequences." With that, she turned on her heel and moved toward the center of the gathering, leaving Luke to absorb the shock of her unilateral decision. That confrontation was the spark that ignited a long, bitter struggle, one that pitted the fiercely independent spirit of a working farmer against the relentless, intrusive power of an overbearing HOA. As dusk settled over Mason Homestead that evening, Luke stood alone before his barn, determination etched on his face. He knew that if Kerren and her cronies continued to meddle in his affairs, he would be forced to fight for every inch of his legacy. And in that moment, as the first stars twinkled overhead, Luke Mason silently vowed that he would not let bureaucratic tyranny dictate the fate of his home. The very next day, as Luke prepared for another day in the fields, he discovered an official notice stapled to his farmhouse door. The letter, embossed with the HOA's crest and signed by Kerren herself, accused him of violating community standards by permitting unauthorized events on his property. It demanded that he either conform by modifying his barn's usage immediately or face a fine of $750. The language was cold and legalistic, an unmistakable message from Kerren. Your property is not above the rules. Luke's heart pounded as he read the notice. He knew in his bones that his barn had always been a private haven, a place to honor tradition and foster community ties on his own terms. With a deep breath, he reviewed local zoning laws and property rights documents that clearly supported his right to use his barn as he wished. Confident in the legality of his actions, Luke drafted a formal response disputing the fine and citing the regulations in his favor. That morning, as a light drizzle dampened the earth, a sedan pulled up to Mason Homestead. Two uniformed inspectors stepped out, clipboards in hand, and made their way toward the barn. "Mr. Mason," one said flatly, "we're here on behalf of the HOA to verify that your property complies with community standards." Luke met them at the door, voice steady despite the turmoil. "My barn has been in my family for generations. It's used for private events and community gatherings, activities that are fully compliant with local law. Despite his explanation and the copies of ordinances he produced, the inspectors scribbled notes, compelled by Kerren's orders. Soon after, Kerren arrived in person, her presence as commanding as ever. Dressed immaculately and exuding authority, she surveyed the scene with a dismissive air. "Luke, you must understand that these rules are not negotiable. If you do not adjust your property immediately, you will face further penalties." Her tone brooked no argument. With that, she turned and marched away, leaving Luke to contemplate the mounting intrusion on his property. That evening, as he sat on his porch beneath a sky streaked with twilight, Luke reflected on the blatant overreach of the HOA. His barn, his heart and soul, was being hijacked by Kerren's rigid interpretation of community standards. Determined not to be bullied, Luke resolved that he would gather every legal and factual defense available. The battle had only just begun, and he knew that the next moves would test his resolve and ingenuity. Over the next several days, Kerren's tactics grew increasingly aggressive. What began as a single unauthorized wedding event quickly escalated into a full-scale campaign against Luke's right to manage his property. Notices accusing him of various infractions, unsanctioned events, improper use of historic structures, noncompliance with aesthetic guidelines, popped up on his barn doors, fences, and even along the driveway. The language in these notices was harsh, each one a calculated attempt to undermine his authority. Rumors swirled among the neighbors that Kerren was bullying several homeowners into submission. One long-suffering resident confided to Luke that she had received fines for minor infractions that never once had been enforced before. Another board member, frustrated with the arbitrary actions, secretly revealed that Kerren had been diverting HOA funds to support her personal vendetta against nonconformity. Realizing that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of abuse, Luke began to document every encounter. He installed discreet cameras around the barn and property lines, capturing footage of inspectors arriving unannounced, stern faces as they measured the building, and whispered conversations among HOA officials hinting at personal grudges. Each piece of evidence reinforced his growing suspicion that Kerren was using the HOA as a tool for her personal agenda. By the time the next HOA board meeting was announced, tension in the community had reached a boiling point. Homeowners, many of whom had also received unjust fines or been harassed by inspectors, began to rally around Luke's cause. The meeting hall was packed with residents clutching copies of photographs, video clips, and documented incidents that painted a damning picture of Kerren's overreach. As Luke stepped up to the podium at the meeting, he recounted, in a clear, methodical tone, the timeline of events, from the unauthorized wedding in his barn to the barrage of punitive notices. He projected images of the torn-down marquee, the evidence of fines, and even snippets of overheard conversations that revealed misdirected funds. The room grew silent as every resident listened, many nodding in quiet agreement, their collective frustration boiling over into a call for accountability. Even some previously loyal board members exchanged troubled glances as Luke's evidence mounted. What had once been seen as a battle over aesthetics now took on a much larger dimension, a fight for individual rights against an increasingly tyrannical HOA. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the community was ready to challenge Kerren's despotic rule. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and every documented infraction only deepened the resolve of those affected. One fateful morning, Luke awoke to a sight that confirmed his worst fears. His beloved barn had been transformed into a makeshift wedding venue once again, this time without his consent and with even more brazen disregard for his property. Kerren had scheduled yet another event, complete with extravagant decorations, and even hired external vendors to upgrade the barn's appearance, all under the guise of enforcing community standards. But what truly infuriated Luke was the fact that, amidst all this, his barn had been cleared for the event without any communication from him. The final insult came when, in the midst of the chaos, Luke discovered that his trusted barn door had been forcibly removed using an electric cutter, a tool that had sliced through years of history in moments. The damage was not accidental. It was a calculated act of vandalism designed to force him into submission. With his emotions boiling, Luke knew that mere words would no longer suffice. It was time to strike back in a manner that would be impossible to ignore. Drawing upon his resourcefulness and his deep connection with the land, Luke hatched a bold plan. Over the years, he had raised a spirited herd of goats, mischievous creatures known for their tenacity and unpredictable antics. These goats were more than just farm animals. They were part of the homestead's personality, symbols of its rugged independence. With a defiant glint in his eye, Luke decided to release his goats onto the barn's dance floor during Kerren's next big event, a move that would transform her ostentatious wedding into an unforgettable spectacle of chaos and laughter. As the day of the event approached, Luke meticulously prepared. He quietly trained his goats to respond to his commands, ensuring that at the right moment, they would charge into the barn with all the unbridled energy of nature unleashed. The plan was set. While Kerren and her entourage would be busy with formalities and high-minded speeches, the goats would create pandemonium on the dance floor, trampling the overly arranged decor and sending guests scrambling in confusion. When the moment arrived, as the band struck up a lively tune and guests swirled on the dance floor beneath sparkling chandeliers, Luke gave the signal. Out from the barn's open doors burst the herd of goats, their bleats and bounding steps immediately disrupting the overly choreographed proceedings. The sight was both hilarious and chaotic. Guests laughed, shouted, and scattered, while Kerren's carefully constructed image began to crumble as she struggled to regain control. The room erupted in a mixture of shock and amusement. What had been intended as an ostentatious celebration of conformity was now transformed into a riotous demonstration of natural freedom. Neighbors captured every moment on their phones, and social media buzzed with the image of Kerren desperately trying to shepherd her guests away from the rampaging goats. For Luke, the spectacle was not just payback. It was a resounding statement that his property, his traditions, and his very way of life could not be subjugated by arbitrary rules or tyrannical figures. As the chaos subsided and order was eventually restored, the mood among the residents had shifted irrevocably. The spectacle of the goats had become a symbol of the community's rejection of Kerren's heavy-handed control. Luke's defiant act had turned the tide of public opinion, and even those who had once hesitated now openly questioned the legitimacy of the HOA's actions. Desperate to reclaim her dwindling authority, Kerren orchestrated one last power play. With the fallout from the goat incident still fresh and public sentiment firmly against her, she resolved to use legal intimidation to crush any remaining dissent. Late one evening, Kerren called the local police and reported that the barn's chaos had escalated into a public disturbance that endangered community safety. Her claim was as ludicrous as it was desperate, an attempt to force the authorities to side with her in a final bid for control. Within minutes, a police car pulled up to Mason Homestead. The responding officers found Luke calmly supervising the aftermath of the disrupted wedding, his demeanor relaxed yet resolute. When questioned, Luke presented copies of permits, safety certifications for his barn, and evidence showing that the event had, if anything, been a spontaneous outburst of creativity rather than a threat to public safety. Kerren's attempt to leverage law enforcement backfired spectacularly. Not only did the police find no grounds for her complaint, but in a twist of poetic justice, surveillance footage later emerged showing Kerren herself sneaking onto the property with a private investigator, a covert attempt to dig up dirt on Luke. The footage, captured by hidden cameras Luke had installed as a precaution, clearly showed Kerren trespassing and triggering security sensors on the property. At the next HOA meeting, with a hushed and tense audience, Luke took to the podium. He calmly played the incriminating footage, leaving little room for doubt. This, he stated, is proof that Kerren's desperation has led her to break the law in a bid to maintain her stranglehold on our community. The room fell into stunned silence before erupting into murmurs and exclamations of disbelief. The evidence was overwhelming, and Kerren's final, desperate move had exposed her true nature for all to see. The police, now fully apprised of the situation, issued Kerren a trespassing citation, a symbolic and legal blow that further undermined her authority. The community's response was immediate and decisive. Kerren's already faltering influence began to collapse under the weight of the evidence against her. In the wake of Kerren's public debacle and her last desperate bid to reclaim power, the community rallied like never before. An emergency town hall meeting was called in a drab community center, where frustrated residents packed the room, armed with Luke's meticulously compiled dossier, photographs, video clips, and eyewitness testimonies documenting the abusive practices of the HOA under Kerren's leadership. The atmosphere was charged with anger and resolve. One by one, homeowners recounted their own experiences of unjust fines, invasive inspections, and arbitrary enforcement. The collective voice grew louder as the evidence revealed a pattern of abuse. Kerren was not simply enforcing rules. She was abusing power for personal vendettas. After hours of impassioned debate, the vote was taken. The result was overwhelming. The community voted to dissolve the current HOA board and remove Kerren from her position as president. The decision was swift and unanimous, a resounding rejection of a tyrant who had imposed her will on everyone. The news made local headlines, with reporters hailing it as a victory for grassroots democracy over bureaucratic tyranny. City officials, prompted by the scandal and mounting evidence, launched an independent investigation into the board's financial practices. It emerged that funds had been misappropriated to support Kerren's personal agenda, and numerous fines had been issued solely to intimidate nonconformists. The legal fallout was swift. Heavy fines were imposed on former board members, and several individuals faced charges for fraud and mismanagement. For Luke, the collapse of the HOA was a bittersweet victory, a vindication of his fight for Mason Homestead and a turning point for the community. As he sat on his porch one crisp morning, watching the sunrise over fields that now thrummed with hope, he allowed himself a quiet smile. His electrified barn and the memory of the Goat Rebellion stood as a beacon of defiant innovation, a tangible symbol that tyranny could never subdue the spirit of an independent community. Across the neighborhood, the oppressive shadow of the HOA lifted, replaced by a new era of transparency, collaboration, and self-determination. The residents of Mason Homestead and its surroundings now looked forward to a future where their rights were respected and their voices heard, a future built on unity and collective power. In the aftermath of the community uprising, the full force of the law descended upon the remnants of the corrupt HOA. City inspectors and independent auditors pored over the board's financial records, uncovering a web of misappropriation and fraudulent fines. It turned out that funds earmarked for community improvements had been siphoned off to bolster Kerren's personal agenda, and many fines had been issued without any genuine basis in the rules. Armed with this damning evidence, a coalition of affected residents, led by Luke, filed a class action lawsuit against the former HOA board. In a series of public hearings, Luke presented his comprehensive dossier: video recordings of intrusive inspections, photos of baseless violation notices, and even footage of Kerren's own illegal trespassing. The courtroom became a stage for the community's collective voice. A judge, clearly moved by the overwhelming evidence, ruled that the board's practices were a blatant abuse of power. Heavy fines were levied against the board members, and several individuals faced criminal charges for fraud and mismanagement. Moreover, the settlement mandated that all misappropriated funds be redirected toward community development projects, and that a new, democratically elected board be established. The verdict was hailed as a watershed moment, a clear message that arbitrary authority would never be tolerated. Local media soon splashed headlines about the fall of the HOA tyrants, and the case became a shining example of what can happen when a united community stands up for its rights. For Luke and his neighbors, this legal triumph was not just about financial restitution. It was a powerful reclaiming of their autonomy and a beacon for future generations. With the legal verdict and public humiliation firmly in place, Kerren's personal world disintegrated. Once the formidable enforcer of community standards, she became the embodiment of tyranny and hubris. Forced to resign from her position, Kerren was swiftly abandoned by former allies who had grown weary of her heavy-handed tactics. Her once impeccable home, symbolic of the status she had so desperately clung to, was soon put on the market amid rumors of financial ruin. Her personal relationships, too, suffered. Whispers spread that her longtime partner had finally left, unable to endure the relentless stress and public disgrace. Attempts to find a new foothold in the property management world were met with derision. At a local job fair, potential employers exchanged skeptical glances as she meekly offered her resume, her reputation now a cautionary tale rather than a badge of honor. In one painfully memorable moment, Kerren appeared at a city hall meeting, trying to defend her actions as necessary measures for the sake of community order. Instead, her feeble justifications only deepened the residents' contempt. The community, emboldened by their recent victories, mocked her with knowing smiles and pointed remarks. Her downfall was complete, a dramatic fall from grace that left her a shell of the once feared enforcer she had been. Luke, witnessing Kerren's collapse, felt no gloating triumph, only a calm satisfaction that justice had prevailed. Every public misstep, every financial setback, and every whispered comment reaffirmed that no one, not even a self-styled enforcer, was above accountability. Kerren's personal ruin became a lasting symbol of poetic justice, a stark reminder that tyranny always crumbles under the collective will of a united community. As the seasons turned and summer gave way to the mellow hues of early autumn, the community around Mason Homestead embraced a renewed sense of freedom and unity. The days of oppressive HOA fines and arbitrary rule enforcement were now relegated to the past, a cautionary chapter in the neighborhood's history. Luke sat on his porch, the gentle hum of the electrified barn and the distant bleats of his goats creating a comforting symphony. The memory of Kerren's misdeeds, including the absurd wedding held in his barn, was now part of local lore. In a final playful twist of fate, during a celebratory block party held in the community park, a longtime friend presented Luke with a hilariously oversized HOA violation notice, accusing him of excessive go-to raves and unauthorized dance floor shenanigans. With a wry smile and a twinkle in his eye, Luke accepted the mock citation and quipped, "I guess they really did try." The remark sent the crowd into a roar of laughter and applause, a fitting mic drop that encapsulated the community's defiance and resilience. As twilight descended and the electrified barn cast a soft glow across the fields, neighbors lingered together, sharing memories of their hard-won victory over arbitrary authority. The oppressive rules that once loomed large were replaced by a democratic, community-led governance that celebrated individuality and innovation. In that quiet, reflective moment on his porch, as Luke sipped his drink and watched the stars emerge, he knew that Mason Homestead and the surrounding neighborhood were now safe from tyranny. The legacy of Kerren's reign of petty control had been consigned to a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most relentless enforcers eventually fall when faced with the united spirit of a community determined to live free. Fade to black.